Hi, everybody. Greaves here again. So, I'm going to give you a little bit of a historical perspective on how the scientific theory of evolution by natural selection came about. First, though, I want to start with a different idea that was pretty prevalent well before the 1800s, but was finally described by a guy named Jean-Baptiste Lamarck. Lamarck was the head of the Natural Science Museum for France in the early 1800s. And in 1809, he published a long-held idea by many naturalists at the time. Um, we would call them biologists now. But he had published the idea of um, the theory of inheritance of acquired characteristics. Okay. Inheritance of acquired characteristics. So basically, what he described is he described this idea that organisms gain traits during their lifetime because they need them, or they use them a lot, or they lose traits because they disuse them. They don't use them. Okay? So organisms during their lifetime acquire or get characteristics because of need or use, or they get rid of characteristics because of disuse. Okay, so an example, going back to our cheetah example, and this is why I had you guys circle those particular phrases, because they're very Lamarckian, very inheritance of acquired characteristics, is that Lamarck would have said cheetahs got faster because they needed to catch their prey. Um, but there's a problem with that. So hold on, I'm going to tell you the second part of his idea here. And the second part of his idea was this. Then those individuals passed on those traits to their offspring. Now, we do know that traits can be passed on to offspring through sperm and egg. We have studied that quite extensively in genetics. So actually, this part is correct. But his first part of his idea here, or of the prevalent idea at the time that he described, is not. It can be disproven. So I'm going to give you an analogy to this. So Lamarck would have said that the cheetahs got faster because they needed to catch their prey. So it would be like this kind of situation. It would be like saying, let's say we have the University of Colorado track team, and they're competing against another team that's better than them, so they need to get better to win. Now, do they just get better because they need to, or do they get better because they have good coaching and training and they work for it and uh, and train to get their bodies to do that? My guess is you probably know that coaching and training, if any of you play sports, is what gets your body in shape so that you could get faster. Okay, um, so So, according to Lamarck, he would say that the track team got faster because they needed to, and then when all the members of the track team had babies, they would pass on their super fast traits, and when their kids grew up, they would automatically be as fast as their track parents. Now, I think you guys know that that does not happen. You have to train for that, and then you have kids eventually, and they, as well, if they want to be fast, they're going to have to train. But they might not be as fast. They're going to have some variation from their other parent as well. Okay, so that's an example of why this doesn't work. Okay. So ultimately, this inheritance of acquired characteristics can be disproven. And that is why I had you guys circle those and replace them. Uh, and then what ended up happening is we had another scientist named Charles Darwin. And he began gathering evidence in the like 18 teens, 1820s, and gathered evidence for a lot of years before he published his idea. And his idea is the one that we have been studying. That is the scientific theory of evolution by natural selection, with all of those tenets that we were practicing. Now, next week we will look at some of the things he was looking at, but I'm going to give you just a little tiny preview. He ended up going on a ship called the Beagle as a naturalist, basically to keep the captain company. And as he went and they did a trip around the world, I think that the captain was like mapping the area. Or something like that. I'm not totally sure. But Darwin would get off and collect specimens of all kinds of things, plants, animals, all kinds of different living things, or record his observations of them. And he would send them back on other ships. He was a really good taxidermist and really good at drawing out leaves and stuff. But I want to show you one thing that he looked at. So I'm going to add this photo. And okay, so I have my two photos here. So here's one of the things he did. He was in South America in Ecuador and that was on the that's on the western side of of South America, and there were fossils of giant tortoises. And then what the ship does is it sails 900 miles west to these islands called the Galapagos Islands. You've probably heard of them. Galapagos. And there's several different islands there. And what he noticed lots of things, which we'll look at later on, but one of the things, just for my example today, is he noticed that there were these giant tortoises. All the islands had giant tortoises, but on one of the islands where it tended to be very dry, there wasn't a lot of plants that were down low close to the ground. And so there were plants up high. And you may notice here, do you guys see the size of this neck on this tortoise? Here, I'll go in yellow. Look at this thing. I mean, that is one seriously long neck, okay? And same thing with the legs. Now, on another island, there were tortoises that were low and close to the ground, like this guy over here. And those were more wet islands, and they tended to have a lot of plants that were low. Okay, and so he started to get started to realize that, hey, maybe what's happening is so these turtles get out to these islands, which being giant would help you get there. And then once they're there, the tortoises that are on the drier islands, over generations, they tended to get longer and longer necks, and the other ones tended to stay small. So the question was like, how would that happen? And that's how he started to figure out his theory of natural selection. This idea that, hey, of all the tortoises that came over, there must have been variations. Some had longer and some had shorter necks. They all landed on these islands. But if you happen to land on a dry island, then if you had a slightly longer neck, you might be able to get more food than the guys and gals who didn't have as long of necks. And so they would be better competitors for the resources of food, and when you have lots of food, you can make lots of babies. And so, therefore, they would pass on their long neck trait to their offspring. And over generations, you get a little bit longer neck tortoises mating with little bit longer neck tortoises, and you'll get even longer neck babies. And then the opposite was true for these guys over here who were low to the ground. That for them, the tortoises that had shorter necks tended to do better and be more effective at getting food. And so they ended up with more food and they had um, a lot of energy so they could make babies. And then over generations, more and more of the babies had the shorter dome shape. And the last quick thing I'm going to say on here is I want to address this guy, Alfred Russel Wallace, because he independently had the same idea that Darwin did. He was doing traveling around and seeing the same kinds of things, and he independently came up with the theory of evolution by natural selection.